Now, let's go from dolls. What came next? Was it children's clothing or women's clothing?
It was, believe it or not, I was doing some collectible quilts as well. And those were selling really well.
Yeah. Your stuff is just amazing.
Well, thank you. And then I did some children's clothing. It seemed like a sort of more natural segue, from the dolls. And as a matter of fact, my very first customer was purchased a child's skirt that had a drawstring, and she declared that this is something she wanted for herself, and she took it away. But that was my first sale to, in the shop, to an actual woman as opposed to someone buying for their children.
So going from dolls to children's clothing is, what did you base your women's line on? Was it more the clothing that were on the dolls or more the children's clothing that were for grown-ups?
Right.
Or?
People were requesting that I sort of translate what I was doing for the dolls, in terms of their costuming to women's clothing. But what I found when I started to develop the women's clothing is I would more or less take things away and start streamlining, because my idea is that it has to be, you've got to be able to wear it. It's got to be wearable.
Oh yeah.
You've got to bring it into your everyday.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just want to talk a little bit about the design process and what inspires you when you're creating a doll, or what inspires you when you're creating an article of clothing.
Right, it's very different. I find that for the articles of clothing, I think about the practical considerations. Is it launderable, and
Wow.
will the fabric, sort of be there, and last for a duration. Because the whole idea is to build a wardrobe as opposed to just to dispense of things. To consume and dispense of
Interesting.
things.
That was an interesting way to think of it.
Yeah, and whereas for the dolls, it's like the sky is really the limit. So it's really
you can get fanciful.
Pulling in from the imagination.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
as opposed to practical considerations.
So besides practicality, when you are designing women's clothing, what do you take your inspiration from? I mean, does something, you might see something in nature or whatever, and it just...
like, for example, this past fall, there was, the ginkgo tree was just,
Okay.
Yeah, so the leaves were, right there in the ground before the fruit, and those frilly shapes. You look at every leaf is different, not one, even though it's coming from the same tree. And if you look at them, they're triangular with a little sort of frill at the bottom, and the grace of the stem at the top, and they look like little skirts, So I did a series of what I call the Lula skirt. It's just a basic shape. And play with the materials and the trims, and
do you do the draping? Do you have like a mannequin and you do draping and all that, and to see how it looks?
I do. Wow. And I'll swatch. Just look at various materials and see what's calling out to me. And then I play with color. I play with how colors relate to each other. So like anything on the rack, there has to be some sort of relatability, so it actually tells a story.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
That's so fascinating.